The rain hammered against the hospital window like 1,000 tiny fists, demanding entry, and Marcus stood there with his forehead pressed to the cold glass, trying to remember the last time he'd felt anything other than numb. His daughter's medical bills were stacked on the chair behind him, each one a fresh reminder that love, no matter how fierce, couldn't pay for the treatment that might save her life. 8 years old, and little Maya had already fought harder than most people would in a lifetime. The leukemia had returned, more aggressive this time, and the experimental treatment their insurance refused to cover was their last hope. Marcus had sold everything, his car, his late wife's jewelry, even the guitar he'd planned to give Maya when she turned 16. It still wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. He didn't notice the woman at first. She was just another shadow in the fluorescent-lit hallway, another soul carrying her own weight through these corridors of hope and heartbreak. But when he turned from the window, ready to return to Maya's room and pretend everything would be okay, their eyes met. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes of stories. She wore a volunteer badge, Margaret, and carried a clipboard, like it was her mission to bring order to chaos. "She's beautiful," Margaret said softly, nodding toward Maya's room where his daughter slept, her small body barely making a dent in the hospital bed. "Your daughter? I've seen you here every day for 3 weeks." Marcus tried to smile, but his face had forgotten how. "Yeah, she's everything." Margaret stepped closer, and Marcus noticed she moved with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. "I lost my daughter to cancer," she said, and the words hung in the air like a prayer. 32 years ago. She was 9. The simple statement cracked something in Marcus's chest. "I'm so sorry," he managed. "Don't be sorry for me," Margaret said, reaching out to touch his arm with surprising strength. "Be angry. Be terrified. Be whatever you need to be. But don't be sorry for an old woman who's had decades to learn how to carry her grief." She paused, studying his face. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." It wasn't an accusation, just a fact delivered with the kind of gentle firmness only grandmothers seemed to master. "Come on, there's a cafeteria downstairs that makes terrible coffee and even worse sandwiches, but you're going to eat one anyway." Marcus wanted to refuse, to stay rooted to his post outside. Maya's door like some kind of guardian angel who'd failed at his only job. But something about Margaret made him follow. Maybe because she understood what it meant to stand in this particular kind of fire and come out the other. Side changed forever. The cafeteria was nearly empty at 11 at night. Margaret bought 2 sandwiches and 2 coffees, despite Marcus's weak protests about not having much cash on him. They sat at a corner table beneath a flickering light that made everything look slightly unreal. "I volunteer here 3 nights a week," Margaret explained, unwrapping her sandwich with practiced efficiency. "Started doing it about 5 years after Emily died. Couldn't save her, but maybe I could help ease someone else's burden. Even just a little." Marcus picked at his food. "The doctors say Maya needs this new treatment. CAR T-cell therapy. It's supposed to reprogram her immune system to fight the cancer." He laughed bitterly. "Costs $250,000. Insurance says it's experimental. Experimental. As if my daughter's life is some kind of science project they can just opt out of funding." "How much have you raised?" Margaret asked, and there was no pity in her voice, only pragmatism. $63,000. From GoFundMe, from selling everything we own, from my parents who don't have anything to give but gave it anyway. I'm working double shifts at the warehouse when I'm not here." He rubbed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure. "It's not enough. It's never going to be enough." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, sipping her terrible coffee and staring at something Marcus couldn't see. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, stronger somehow, filled with a determination that made him look up. "What if I told you I could help?" Marcus felt hope flare in his chest and immediately tried to smother it. Hope was dangerous. Hope made the fall that much harder. "Margaret, you don't—" "My husband and I never had much," she interrupted, setting down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. "Richard was a high school teacher and I was a librarian. But we lived simply, and when Richard died 10 years ago, he left me the house and his pension, and some savings we'd been putting away for retirement. We never got to enjoy together. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I don't have children to leave it to. No grandchildren. Just a nephew in California who already has more money than sense and barely remembers to call on Christmas. Margaret, no. I can't. You're not taking anything, she said firmly. I'm giving it. There's a difference. I've spent the last decade trying to figure out what to do with money. I never needed much of, and you've just told me exactly what it's for. Marcus felt his throat close up. You don't even know us. I know enough. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, her skin papery and warm. I know you're a father who would burn down the world for his daughter. I know that little girl in there deserves a chance. And I know that if I don't do this, if I sit on that money and let it gather dust while a child who could be saved isn't saved, then what was any of it for? What was Emily's life for? What was my life for? The tears Marcus had been holding back for weeks finally broke through. He put his head in his hands and sobbed. Great, wrenching sounds that he tried to muffle but couldn't. Margaret didn't tell him it, was okay or offer empty platitudes. She just held his hand and let him break, the way someone who understood grief could. When he could finally breathe again, Marcus looked up at this woman who was offering everything to a stranger. Why? He whispered. Margaret smiled, and it transformed her whole face. Because someone should have been able to help Emily, and no one could. Because you're not a stranger. You're a father in the worst fight of his life. Because I can. It's that simple, Marcus. I can help, so I will. The next 3 days moved in a blur. Margaret was like a force of nature, making calls, talking to hospital administrators, cutting through red tape with the authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating bureaucracy. She wrote the check without ceremony, just a simple signature that meant everything. The hospital approved Maya for the treatment. Marcus tried to thank her 1,000 different ways, but Margaret would just wave him off. You can thank me by being there when Maya wakes up cancer-free. That's all I want. The treatment was brutal. Maya spent 2 weeks in isolation, while the modified cells fought their war inside her tiny body. Marcus never left, sleeping in a chair by her bed, reading her favorite stories until his voice went hoarse. Margaret visited every day, bringing crossword puzzles and hope. On day 16, Maya's numbers started to improve. On day 21, the doctors used the word remission for the first time. On day 30, they said it again, this time with cautious smiles. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same hospital lobby where he'd first truly talked to Margaret. But everything was different. Maya was beside him, thin but laughing, a Disney princess backpack on her shoulders. She was going home. Really home, not just for a day or two before returning for more treatment, but actually going home. Margaret was there to see them off, and Maya threw her arms around the older woman's waist. Thank you for saving me, she said in her sweet, small voice. Margaret knelt down, ignoring the protest from her bad leg, and cupped Maya's face in her hands. Sweet girl, you saved yourself by fighting so hard. I just helped clear the path. Marcus couldn't find words big enough. So he just embraced Margaret, this stranger who'd become family, this woman who'd turned her grief into grace. I'll never be able to repay you, he said. You already have, Margaret said, pulling back to look at him. Every time I see you two together, every time I think about Maya, growing up and going to college and falling in love and having her own family, someday that's the payment. You've given my money a purpose. You've given my loss a meaning. That's worth more than you'll ever know. As they walked out into the sunshine, Maya's hand in his, Marcus turned back one last time. Margaret stood in the lobby window, waving, backlit by the fluorescent lights that had seemed so harsh before, but now looked almost gentle. He thought about the chain, reaction of kindness, how one person's selflessness could echo forward through time, how Margaret's choice would ripple through Maya's life and the lives of everyone she'd touch. That night, tucking Maya into her own bed for the first time in months, Marcus finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell him. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about one human being seeing another, human beings suffering and deciding that the only acceptable response was to help. Not because it made sense, not because there was anything to gain, but simply because it was possible. Dad? Maya asked sleepily, clutching the stuffed elephant Margaret had given her. Is Miss Margaret an angel? Marcus smoothed her hair, his heart so full it hurt. Yeah, baby. I think maybe she is. Years would pass. Maya would grow strong and healthy, would graduate high school with honors, would become a pediatric oncologist herself. Margaret would be there for all of it, folded into their family as naturally as breathing. And on quiet evenings, when Marcus looked back on the moment his life could have gone either way, he would think about the woman in the hospital hallway who chose kindness when she could have chosen anything else. Because that's what humanity looks like in its purest form. Not grand gestures or viral videos, but one person saying to another, I see you. I see your pain, and I refuse to look away. Her name was Margaret, and she saved more than just a life. She saved hope itself, proved it was real and worth holding on to even in the darkest hours. And in doing so, she reminded everyone lucky enough to know her story that we're all connected, all responsible for each other, all capable of being someone else's miracle if we're just brave enough to try.